is the right time to stand up for freedom? Could it be when you start to feel creating children who'll inherit the pain and the debt of this nation and be slaves to the banks that cause hyperinflation, who are masters of commerce, lies, and bad legislation? Whoa, if you looked in the eyes of 1,000 young children through fences of razors, their innocence stolen as the red flag of tyranny flies in the open, is that when you finally notice? Whoa, whoa, but I'm only a stranger here. I'm a long, long way from my home, and they say I can't change all the things I find strange, for what can one man do alone?
Welcome back to the Liberty Test, where we analyze issues through the lens of the Libertarian Party of New York's platform. I'm Dan Castello, your host, and I'm joined by fellow activists Robert Schuon and Rose Leatherman. Tonight, we're tackling a legal concept that challenges our core beliefs: qualified immunity. We're going to discuss how qualified immunity fits, or rather doesn't fit, within the libertarian vision of government. We'll explore the arguments for and against the doctrine, what reforms might be more consistent with our platform, and how we can better secure everyone's unalienable rights. As always, let's begin with our platform, which rests on the idea of inherent, unalienable individual rights, and asserts that governments exist to protect these rights, not infringe upon them. However, qualified immunity is a doctrine that shields government officials from lawsuits, even when they violate your rights, unless there's an extremely specific prior court ruling that says that exact action is illegal. From a libertarian perspective, this raises major concerns. It directly contradicts the idea of equal justice under the law, creating a two-tiered system where government officials are held to a lesser standard of accountability than the rest of us. When those in power are not fully responsible for their actions, they're emboldened to violate our rights more often, eroding those rights and public trust in the system. This is why, in our section 3.3, we specifically state that individuals may allow others to aid in their defense, but those who provide assistance have no more right to use force than those requesting it, and they carry the same responsibilities. Furthermore, those delegated the authority to assist in defense shall not be granted immunity and must be held accountable for their actions to the same extent as anyone else. But here's where it gets interesting and where we can set up a good discussion. The state and those who defend qualified immunity argue that this protection is necessary. They say that without it, government officials would be constantly facing frivolous lawsuits, which would make it difficult to do their jobs and might even deter good people from public service. They argue qualified immunity is needed to allow public servants to act decisively without fear of constant legal challenges. Essentially, they present it as necessary to maintain order and prevent chaos while carrying out public policy. So, does qualified immunity pass the Liberty Test? Are the statists right? Do government agents need special treatment under the law? Rose, let's start with your take. What's more important, the potential for individual abuses by government officials, or the potential for chaos and disruption if they can't act decisively without fear of legal action? Or is there a way that we can have both?
That's an interesting one, because in theory, if we're going to have a state at all, its purpose should be to protect the individual from aggressors, both against their persons and their property. So if we're going to have state agents who are tasked with protecting individual rights, they need to be able to do their jobs without having to constantly second guess themselves and constantly worry that, oh, can I do this action safely, or will I get in trouble later? Can I do this? For example, if you have some crazed murderer on the loose and you have a police officer who's pursuing that murderer, should we want to create a situation where they may be afraid to, for example, enter somebody's private yard and accidentally break something of theirs and then face a lawsuit? Or do we want to say, you know what, if they were doing their job in good faith, then we should give them the benefit of the doubt, and we should assume that they were trying to do their job, and we should not hold them accountable. However, in practice, this has created a situation where, unless a particular act has been ruled explicitly to have violated someone's constitutional rights, cops can use the defense that they did not know it was illegal. And this has created weird situations, such as like a ruling saying that a cop cannot unleash an attack dog on someone if they're in a grassy ravine, but then they can argue that, oh, but this guy was technically in a creek in the woods, not a grassy ravine, and I unleashed my dog on him unnecessarily. But you can't rule that this was excessive force, and he can't sue us because it wasn't explicitly already part of the law. Or it's created situations where a cop can accidentally raid the wrong house, have someone's dog bark at the cop, try to shoot the dog, and then accidentally hit the resident's child and still be immune from consequences because, hey, qualified immunity. I thought I was at the right house and I thought I was stopping crimes. So it creates a serious problem where individual cops can effectively violate individual rights with impunity and rarely face consequences.
The thing is, though,
So I would say the idea that we can have both is, and it sounds nice, but I don't think that we actually can. I think that state agents always should have to be concerned about facing the consequences of their actions if they overstepped.
well, the thing is, it's more along the lines
Bob,
of
do you have any thoughts
is,
on any changes given New York's current legal
absolutely.
framework, which
Because
I know is heavily centralized and hierarchical?
yeah,
Are there any specific or maybe even incremental changes to the structure of law enforcement that we could introduce that would still align with libertarian principles, but wouldn't be like a radical change?
well, the thing is, the whole issue comes down to negligence or deliberate illegal action, right? So that's the first part of this. Because we're dividing because always the claim, okay, by law enforcement is that they were just doing their job, and that's the base claim for all qualified immunity. Okay, the problem with that is that that's not always the case. Okay, if you are serving a warrant, at what point does misreading the address, then compounding it by going into another person's property mistakenly, then using deadly force against a pet or a person, and then claiming all of that is under the jurisdiction? Well, I was just trying to do my job. See, it's the same thing. Like, I'll give a good example: airline pilots. If an airline pilot does something that's negligent, they get hammered. They're actually hammered worse than an average person because you should have known what you're doing, right? That's literally the claim that's made. So once the NTSB releases their report and it says, oh, this was pilot error, they get filed with a zillion lawsuits, which they have to cover on their own insurance, okay, to defend themselves against liability. How is this? They're a professional, right? They go through school. As a matter of fact, I would dare say they go through more schooling than the law enforcement community does, and they go through recurrent training every 6 months. So they're still liable. How does the law enforcement community magically get a free, get out of jail free card, if you will? Bad analogy, but the point is there. And everybody has responsibility for their actions. And we're not even talking here about deliberately breaking the law. Okay, so we're not even in the cases where the officer deliberately went after somebody outside of their job description, outside of the law, because they didn't like that person or they just decided to be a jerk that day. And look, 99% of law enforcement does the best job they can. Okay, they are trying to enforce the law. That's the standard they're held to. They're not there to protect you. They're there by Supreme Court ruling. They said they are there to uphold the law, which is a completely different standard, by the way, than defending the population. So the fact that they're doing that is a good thing, and it's good for society. However, the fact that they're not held to at least a standard.
Well, wait a minute. We as libertarians have already asserted, and you can look at our platform, that government really only has one job.
Yeah.
And you've just dropped the bombshell
But
that under the
their
current
job is
legal
to
framework,
defend
that's
our
not
rights.
their job.
That's the government's job, is defend our rights from internal or external abusers. Okay, so whether it's a foreign country that's coming in to try and attack our rights, or some person who is outside of the law. All right, the literal definition of outlaw
Yeah.
was somebody who operates outside the law. And
So are we saying that it's unrealistic to pursue reforms within the current legal framework?
I don't think it is. I think there is a good possibility to do this. The problem is you have to basically get enough political will together to say, look, we believe in the police. The police are there to protect us when stuff goes wrong. Okay, when someone else is breaking the law and attacking us, our property, our families. Okay, they're there to help out. That's the shared. So if you look at our 3.1, this is hey, we're going to bring in a third party to do this because I can't be on 24 hours a day. I might not own a firearm. Maybe we're not capable of using it or defending ourselves effectively, so we want to have a force that can do this. However, there still needs to be that responsibility. So the first case, outside the law, absolutely. Once you are directly violating the law rather than upholding it, my position is that you are no longer a police officer. You're a criminal. You're doing what criminals do. Okay? It's one thing if you are trying to execute your job and something goes wrong. That can happen, especially in that job, because it's so difficult and because you run into so many unexpected circumstances. However, when you deliberately do it, right off the bat, stop right there. That needs to end. Okay, that's the part that needs to really be gone after. And then there's negligence. Now you get into that situation where, what is negligence in terms of police enforcement? How do you assess that? Whether, how much has gone over the line, and then how do you redress what has happened, what damage has occurred? So the example of going to the wrong house, going to the yard, now shooting the family pet, now hitting possibly a bystander in the process, a family member. Okay, these are all things that really can't be covered under your job description. First of all, a mistake was made. That mistake is not on the homeowner. They're home they're home minding their own business, trying to live their life. So you're trying to serve in the wrong place, using deadly force, and then trying to claim that, well, it was my job. No,
it is a really hard job, though.
It absolutely is a hard job. And that's the thing, is that law enforcement should be given a break, but it can't be scot-free. You can't have unlimited, no responsibility. Okay. The converse of authority is responsibility. So if you have a lot of authority, you must have responsibility following that.
Well, Rose, I know you have strong feelings on law enforcement officers. Is it realistic to expect law enforcement officers to be held to that standard, or do we need some completely radically different strategy to enforce the protection of rights?
Well, first of all, like, I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea that if a civilian breaks a law and they didn't know that it was illegal, that's not a defense. Like, the court will tell you that's not our problem that you didn't know it was illegal. It was your responsibility to know to know what you were doing and to know that it was illegal. However, if a police officer clearly violates someone's rights, and then they argue, oh, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to break into the wrong house at 4 a.m. and accidentally shoot their child because there's no established case law saying I can't do that. Like, they're not only are they not held to the same standards as one of us would be, but they're held, like, they should be held to a higher standard because they've been tasked with such an important job of upholding the law and of, in theory, protecting people's rights.
Well, are police unionized in New York? I'm pretty sure
yes,
they're.
they are.
Yeah, right. So
Big
what are
time.
the incentives of government when, I mean, you think about how the system works in New York State and in most states in the country.
Yeah, there's no real, like, there's no real drive to do the best they can because they've got the state-backed unions backing them. This also gets a lot stickier too, because I know we're talking about how if we're going to have police at all, it should be to protect the rights of the individuals. This also gets a lot stickier when you get into rights that directly violate the rights of people, because by that point, you start questioning, why do we even need state agents? Not only are they not protecting us, but they're actively violating our rights. For example, suppose I want to use my property in such a way to, I don't know, run a business out of my house. Okay, it's my property. I'm not aggressing against anybody. I'm not violating anyone else's rights, but I don't have the correct permission slip from the state. So they send agents of the state after me.
Right. And this goes back to the libertarian. The libertarian claim is that the state enforces everything at the barrel of a gun. Because there isn't anything, as we all found out in the Eric Garner case, that is so minor that you cannot be killed by the police for doing it. Or refusing to stop doing it. And again, it seems like this is where I think a lot of people have problems with things like that. Enforcing a no selling cigarettes on the street law and ending up with someone dying is so far beyond the pale.
But Bob, it's not about enforcing that law. It's about the state's authority.
Well, that's exactly
right.
What it is.
So not only do they claim qualified immunity there, but they can't even argue that they were acting in good faith to protect the citizens when all they were really doing was enforcing some arbitrary regulation.
Yeah, but the larger principle, though, is that you must uphold the supremacy of the state, because if that falls apart, it would be chaos and disorder.
Yeah, they always
say
that. They use that word anarchy, and it does not mean what you think it means. All right.
Other groups, well, in the absence of the state, there's a risk that other groups might start acting like the state. We might have warlords acting like the state. Anyway, though.
I just saw an article the AP put out. Its headline is Democrats Sue GOP County Executive Over Armed Volunteer Unit They Say Amounts to an Illegal Militia. This is Nassau County. It looks like
I wish they would understand that technically we all are the militia, because New York State has a high tradition. First of all, there is the organized militia, okay, usually under the state guard, okay, but the rest of the population who is of military service age is the unorganized militia. That's what it literally says that, and the state, it's like, again,
statists believe weird things. I mean, the Democratic lawmakers in Nassau are basically saying that the county executive doesn't have the legal authority to form a cadre of special sheriff's deputies. So they're sheriff's deputies with authority to use deadly force or make arrests, because they should only be able to deputize trained law enforcement officers from other agencies, not private citizens.
Sounds like they're worried about their monopoly.
Well, I guess they're going to shut down all the all the sheriff's training operations then, because those aren't from other agencies. So, that's just nonsense. This is a political gamesmanship. But what it comes down to is here's the problem. You have all of this authority that we vest in the police, and for very good reason, but without responsibility. Like here's one of the major problems is that if a police officer grievously violates rights and or the law, okay, and you take them to court and you actually get a judgment, the officer doesn't pay, the union doesn't pay, the municipality pays. So where does municipality get that money? From the taxpayer. So basically you are paying to have a law enforcement officer violate your rights. That's not a tenable situation. That's ridiculous. It's like it doesn't make sense. So we have discussed in the past in our own little groups is, again, why can't they have their own insurance? Okay, it can maybe be group insurance, that's fine, but a regular private insurance policy, okay, that everybody pays into, okay, because any kind of incentive to not have your rates go up is a great incentive to not do whatever that form of behavior is, okay? If you have somebody who goes off the reservation, as it were, and all of a sudden the insurance company's like, yeah, you guys are costing us all this money, we're going to jump your rates 20%. Do you think they're going to do something about it? Of course they are. Money always talks,
Could the current system of government indemnification be restructured?
Yeah, but
or
again,
would it need to be completely eliminated and replaced with,
if you look at
private insurance?
New York City settles lawsuits every single day. No joke. Every single day for ridiculous amounts of money. Okay. But why should they care? Because it's not their money. This is the old argument, the Milton Friedman argument, where government spending other people's money on other people. Well, they don't care because it's not for them and it's not their money. So we're just going to take your tax money and we're going to give it to this person that got harmed. But where is the restraint at that point then on the law enforcement professional? Okay,
it sounds like you're saying that it would need to be purely private.
It's not their money, and there's no
right.
There's no incentive to not accidentally or accidentally in some cases violate somebody's rights.
I mean, what was the one? Was it Georgia? There was that case where, I know we're talking about New York, but there was a case where an entire county would literally go out and troll cars and just pull you over at random, And,
I think it was Texas, right?
No, I think it was like Georgia or Mississippi or somewhere like that. Arkansas, I don't remember the exact state, but it was like this county, and they would literally just, they just basically, it was a tax. If you want to come by, they would just pull you over, write you a ticket. It's like just because they felt
that's like Castle Creek, New York.
Oh yeah, we have that.
Well,
the whole town is just one giant speed trap. Like the speed trap finances the entire town. Right. They'll pull you over if you're going like 5 miles per hour over the speed limit.
Well, see, it's that they can make the argument though. See, if you're going 5 over the speed limit, legally you're breaking the law. Okay, so legally they can write you the ticket. However, when you go and you're not speeding and they still pull you over, see, who's responsible for that? Because again, they're violating your rights. You don't really have a say in it because it's your word against the officers. He's technically an officer of the court. This is the other thing, is that officers of the law enforcement, are technically members of the court. Again, held to a higher standard. When they go into court, they're going to believe them over you because they've taken an oath to say that they're not going to lie. Okay? So what happens when they violate that oath? Okay? Again, now you're destroying the trust of the court system itself because of this person. See, this is where like private institutions for things like this are very, would be very important to help restrain this behavior. Because
Right.
again, if you get enough lawsuits and enough cases, the insurance company's going to say, well, we're jacking your rates 50% this year because of all the stuff that's going on.
Right.
Well-
We see this. We see this with certain private security forces. Like, for example, like Disney World has practically their own police force.
No, it's not practically. It is their own police force.
Yeah. And yet, you don't hear about the Disney security guards killing someone or needlessly brutalizing someone, and they're dealing with all sorts of extremely unsavory people in a day. They're dealing with drunk, combative people. Somehow they're able to escort people out of the park without needlessly harming them.
Because the difference
Could be
is,
sued. Yeah, Disney could be sued. So they have a vested interest in not
yeah,
having
Plus-
security guards that are going to subject them to lawsuits. And also the private security guards could be sued if they use excessive force.
and they could get bad publicity. And this is the difference
That would look
between a
very
municipality and like a private park, like I don't want to use Disney, but what's the other one that's down in Florida? The
Universal.
Universal, okay? Because they do the same thing, but they have an incentive to peacefully end crises. Because again, it looks bad if someone gets hurt,
Mhm.
and it looks bad for their business. And the ironic part about all of this is that, let's say New York City as an example, New York City loses publicity when these things happen and when these bad incidents occur. So they take the loss, but again, because it's a municipality, they don't understand that you're hurting the entire city when these types of things happen.
I think they think that they're untouchable because they're
paychecks are-
already at the top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
It's not just what you're getting at, Rose, which is that the individuals feel like they're untouchable. But I
Right.
also
It's
think
gonna
that they're
come out
so
of, like, their
used to New
paycheck.
York City being top dog, they
Mhm.
can't imagine that it would lose its place. They don't think it matters that their reputation suffers.
Yeah, their paychecks are safe. It's going to be someone down the line who might end up getting a pay cut. So who cares? Like,
Well, they're
I'm
also
not the
in-
one who's going to suffer.
They're indebted to the unions anyway. They can't go against that. So that's what I wanted to ask. I mean, in our conversations, we always wind up emphasizing the role of competition and a free market because obviously as libertarians, we think that's the best way to do things. But in New York, with its heavily unionized police force, I mean, is it possible to add even some elements of market competition to
Yes.
try and incentivize improvements, or do we have to abolish public policing in order to do things the way we would?
Well, okay, one, I mean, I think there is a difference between the state-backed unions and ones that would form in a private competitive market. Like the unions are not necessarily a bad thing as far as collective bargaining goes, but it's a problem when they're backed by the force of the state. Beyond that, yes, if people, like if, for example, a private community through, I don't know, its HOA or its neighborhood watch or whatever decided, okay, when we're not around to guard our neighborhood, we're going to hire such and such private security force. Their only task is going to be to prevent people from burglarizing houses or from mugging people who are out walking or whatever. And if they're not doing a good job, we're going to fire them and we're going to hire someone new. Like this, but we're not going to do things like, say, you can't have a particular substance arbitrarily declared illegal by the state in your house, or else we'll kick down your door at 4 a.m.
So wait a minute, we would have to eliminate most of the laws on the books in order for the system you're describing to actually be efficient, because otherwise you'd end up with very narrowly defined private police organizations with very limited powers and very limited scope for what they could investigate.
I mean, like just
Right.
protecting your rights
Yes.
instead of enforcing like a billion laws that are created
How
by
awful,
politicians
though.
to
That would
tax you.
destroy New York's government structure.
Because how
Ooh,
many people
there's a good idea.
actually want most of these laws enforced? How many of us actually care whether or not our hairdresser has a permission slip from the state?
But how could the monopoly powers and the oligarchies keep their power?
Oh
Defended.
no! How horrible for them!
Well, but this
How
is
horrible
this is
for
the
the
thing.
rent seekers.
See, the problem is though that part of this, it kind of feeds on itself, because again, if people are angry and upset with the police force if they feel that the police force is not honest, is not enforcing the law, but is acting like medieval bandits. Then what happens is then the structure of law and order breaks down, and you run into much worse situations. I mean, look at what happened in 2020 when all the lockdowns happened and everybody disappeared. Okay, and basically policing was pulled back a lot, and you saw Manhattan people breaking into places, people literally stores boarding up their windows to protect themselves from the violence. Okay, because the policing was basically pulled back. And
Well, you're
You had
raising
the
an
worst of both
interesting
worlds.
point. Are you guys familiar with what's happening in South Africa right now?
yeah, partly.
Well, there's been attacks on farms. These farms are more like what you'd imagine with like Western homesteads, out in Indian country. And these very highly organized, very well supplied criminal groups are going out with things like signal jamming equipment, and they are raiding farms, murdering farmers, stealing everything. And the police who are supposed to regularly visit the farms to ensure security aren't, for reasons that we don't need to get into. But farm watch groups have been formed by private citizens, and it's a mixture of private security companies and then local volunteers, and they use radio and other things to stay in touch, and they respond when there's emergencies like this. The people are taking on responsibility for their own protection because the state won't provide it. Here in the United States,
What a
especially in New
Yeah,
York,
we
when
have the
people
worst of
try
both
that,
worlds. We have,
what
yeah,
happens?
exactly. The state refuses to prosecute property crimes, such as someone breaking into your store, looting all of your products, and then making a run for it. However, if you were to say chase down the thief, punch them, and grab your stuff back, you'd be charged with assault. Like we saw this in that case in New York City with the bodega worker, where some guy was angry that his card was turned down when he was trying to buy chips. So he jumps over the counter and starts brutally beating the guy who was working the cash register. The guy stabbed him, and then he gets charged for daring to defend himself. Like you have the state refusing to enforce laws that actually would uphold our rights, but then they come down super hard on people who do fight back and try to
right. Let's
defend
go.
the rights.
Let's go down the list. Richard Penny. There's the first one. Bernie Getz. There's another one. Okay, and guess what? They couldn't convict him. They ended up like Bernie Getz, which, by the way, he has shown up at Libertarian events, and trust me, I've met him. He's not a crazed monster. He's actually a really nice guy. Okay. Basically kept prosecuting him, even though they couldn't get a grand jury to indict him. They literally went around the grand jury, indicted him on a gun crime because evidently his gun was not authorized in the city of New York, and prosecuted him for that. So it's basically, you're supposed to have, the grand jury is supposed to be a check on overzealous prosecutors, but in New York it doesn't matter. They'll just do it anyway. It's
Right.
and this becomes, then they cry, why don't people support law enforcement? Well, because you have a powerful state that refuses to let law enforcement be responsible for anything, right? And then you end up in crying about the fact that the populace is resentful of law enforcement. It's
Yes.
yeah.
They'll stand idly by when a person is lit on fire in a subway car, but they'll come down super hard on someone who tries to restrain some person who's acting super unhinged on the subway car and claiming they're going to kill people. And yet, yeah, people are punished for trying to defend themselves and defend the other occupants.
But then they can't understand why nobody would come to the assistance of the person who is being incinerated. Okay? Because again, I can pretty much guarantee you what went through the mind of everybody on the platform is, I'm not getting involved because if I do, I'm going to pay for it. And think about how sick and twisted that situation is.
All they care about is maintaining their monopoly on force. They need to prohibit any other organization or individual from using force without its permission. That is their primary purpose, to maintain their own authority.
We can't have people realizing that they can defend themselves. Otherwise, they might conclude that they don't need us.
They don't care about defending citizens. We're secondary. As Bob said, they're not even required to. It's about protecting the state.
Remember, the Supreme Court said it's not about protecting the people.
Yeah, well, it's also about generating revenue and facilitating corruption.
Yeah,
precisely. Well, yeah, where they're tax cattle, they exist to generate revenue and ensure the existence of the state. But a lot of people are not ready for that.
Prohibits voluntary exchange. They sell the privilege of engaging in business.
Yep.
Right? The police are the de facto issuers of licenses. Completely undermines the purpose of law, right?
Yep. Like I said, the fact that you have to go to school and get a license to be a florist in the state of New York is the most insane thing ever.
You have to,
and of course they'll come up with a million justifications for this. It's like,
of course, sure, yeah, right. They might
else's dog
use an endangered flower and cause global warming.
Oh, yeah. You have to be. They even trotted out the idea of making it so you had to get a license to be a shampoo technician in a hair salon. Literally, someone who rubs shampoo into someone's head.
But
why? Because what if they do it? Okay, what if they do it wrong? People stop going to that particular hair salon. It's not like,
with the florist, they'll claim, you could put a poisonous flower in there and hurt people. You're gonna put poison ivy in the flowers, and it's like.
And then I think you'll get a bad Yelp review, and you'll probably be open to civil liability if someone gets sick from your flowers.
Well, this is where the state basically creates rules for its own benefit instead of for the people's benefit, and uses law enforcement as its club. And honestly, it's not fair to law enforcement either, because a lot of the people in law enforcement, like I said, a very, very high percentage, are people who have very high ideals. They want to protect people. They want to enforce the law so that everyone is safe. But the problem is, with the state basically removing all responsibility, like I said, it's like Dan said, if you are beholden to the state, because the state decides whether you're doing a good job or not, and basically anything that the state is good with, you can do. That's like, think about that. Absolute, what they say, absolute power corrupts, right? Well, it does, because again, if there's no restraints, people tend to act badly.
Right. They figure, like, when proposing a new law, even if they claim it's for safety or something, they figure how much revenue they're going to generate in the form of fines and fees into their model. So they also could very easily say, okay, we're going to get a few lawsuits if one of our enforcement agents violate someone's rights, but you know what? Ultimately, we're going to make more money than we lose in lawsuits. So, yeah, it's worth doing.
Well, besides that, it's not their money. It comes right from the taxpayers anyway.
Kicked up. Well, not just the taxpayers, but they get grants from the state.
Mm-hmm.
From the federal government.
That's from the taxpayer. So
they can lobby for
it's not. It's from inflation.
Name one form
they borrow
of
the money. They borrow the money.
But it comes from the taxpayer. So.
Ultimately, it comes from the entire world, because we outsource our inflation. But that's a whole other conversation.
Theoretically, it's coming from our money because we're losing it to inflation, because they're just going to the federal government for a bailout.
But it creates a perverse set of incentives at every level of the structure, because if you're a regular beat cop, you are going to be able to err on the side of being more brutal, more
being a bully,
power trippy, more of a bully, because you can, and also because, perversely, the more police behave that way, the more hate they get, especially with the racist narrative, which may or may not be true in any particular instance, but it can create that perception that there's a thin blue line and, there's the tribe of police, and then there's all the hordes of barbarians out there, right?
Right.
And so
They're
that
trying to uphold the law and
attracts,
they're under attack and everyone is against them. Yeah.
right, and that attracts public support from the law and order types and also certain, you know, people who think a certain way about, like, say, ethnic groups and stuff like that. So that's the lowest level. But then above that, you've got the local police agencies, which, get money from, the fact that they have a monopoly on force, basically, and whether they're overtly corrupt or whether it's just that they need public funding and, the more crime there is, the more funding they can get. I mean, whatever,
Well,
there's different
then add on
mechanisms.
the confiscation of funds. That's always a fun one.
And the confiscation, which they can do legally because, oh, this money was used in a crime.
Oh, yeah.
No, 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 no. We suspect this money
Right.
was
And
used
you
in a
need to
crime.
prove that it wasn't.
Yeah, which is
Right.
like, yeah.
Yeah. And,
Yeah,
and money's not your property anyway because the government prints it. So
But even if
it's
it's
not even
property,
yours.
It's
Even
But
value of
anyway,
your labor. Hold on a second. That's the problem is that at what little value it has, it's
Mhm.
still the value of the labor that you put in to get it.
No,
And-
it's not. It's whatever the government
Oh,
says
yeah,
it is.
yeah, that too. But
Right. And then at the next level, you've got the people who actually control that, and they get to control everything below them by deciding who gets that money.
so you're saying that that's why they're really, really upset in Congress right about now? No.
That the deep state is being dismantled
Well,
theoretically
that
to be
is-
replaced by
well,
a different
I
deep
don't know if it's
state.
being dismantled, but
It's being replaced
shook
by
up
a different
little bit.
group of
Well,
oligarchs.
You know what
some
though?
people, some oligarchs are very mad right now because other oligarchs might take their place.
Yeah.
Well,
but just-
that's a good segue because I wanted to ask if our ideal society is one in which private protection agencies and insurance companies do private law enforcement. I mean, let's square the circle. I mean, insurance companies
Okay.
are not very popular right now for a good reason, right?
Okay.
So what is the difference between what we're talking about and what exactly exists now in terms of insurance?
Okay, well,
It's
answer me
kind of
this
the
question.
market.
Wait, answer me this. When was the last time you heard of private security, beating somebody to death as a part of the? Because again, why? Yes, it does happen in any organization. There are going to be incidents. It's impossible not to. Human beings, they're flawed. You can also get people who are not qualified or don't mentally are not able to do the job correctly.
Well, yeah, but to your point, Bob, most protection is actually provided by private companies. You
Right.
would think that with that being the case, there would be more cases of abuse from private protection agencies
Right. But
than
you know what
the
happens if you
public.
violate somebody's rights as a private security officer?
You're
You-
accountable.
You're
Mhm.
fired. You're not only are you fired, but you're liable. Okay, and they'll come after you for it. So again,
Well-
there's a very big incentive there to do your job, but no more than that. And
Well, what about people who would come back and say that the private rent-a-cops, even the high-end ones like Disneyland or like corporate level protection, they're not doing the job that beat cops are, say, in like the city streets of Baltimore or New York City.
well,
So-
the reason
Well-
that they have to do it is because of the situation that's been created. You see, you know what I'm saying? It's a case of if there weren't all these perverse incentives, you wouldn't have the population. Remember, when I don't know about you guys, but a little older, when I was a kid, the officer was the good guy. He was the guy that you would go to protect yourself, to get, hey, I need help, something's wrong, and he would be there. Whereas now, they're literally like soldiers, okay, in terms of armor, riot helmets, you name it. They take that confiscation money and use it to buy literally armored vehicles.
I
Okay,
think you're talking a lot about how they're presented. I don't know that there was ever really any difference, though, in the character
The
of
growth
who
of the
becomes a
state.
police officer and,
Eh,
how they
It has
view
to
their
do with
own
the
job.
growth of the state and the number of laws that they're enforcing. the more victimless crime laws or other laws that most rational people are going to view as overstepping, the more pushback they're going to get, and the more they're going to become militarized, because this reinforces the idea that everyone is against them. It also just increases the number of laws that they have to uphold. But they're going to get a lot more pushback trying to enforce things like drug laws or licensing laws, because one, there are thriving black markets for those, and two, they're going to get less cooperation from the citizens, and that's going to translate into less respect for
And
law enforcement. So
there's one issue not directly related to our discussion, which is I come from a borough of New York City, okay, and I grew up there. And here's one of the major problems I see is the police are put in vehicles that disconnects them from the community. Because we started talking about the beat cop. There are no beat cops anymore. Very, very few. Very few. Okay, most of the time it is one or two officers in a vehicle, okay, driving around. Now that's partly because of the whole situation that's been created and there aren't enough police officers, law enforcement to cover an area. But an officer that is not walking a beat does not have a connection to the neighborhood. I'm sorry, but they don't. Not
Well-
nearly, like there might be a little bit of one, but it's nothing like the man that walks past your shop every day at 10 after 8, okay, that you see in his uniform, carrying his nightstick, right? He's a person to you.
You said that's unrelated, but actually I can't think of anything more related.
if they're community members, because then they have a vested interest in protecting their community and not doing things like firebombing a house.
And the reverse, because you see that officer and he's Officer Joe to you. He's not a steel vehicle driving by at 30 miles an hour once in a while, and the only reason they get out of the car is to bust heads. Okay, this is a difference in the type of policing and that's why a lot of your smaller towns don't have nearly this issue, because when you have an officer walking the street, talking to people, knowing who they are, it's a completely different experience than a heavily armored person coming only when there's serious trouble to basically bust heads any way they can, because at the end of the day, every police officer will tell you the same thing. You know what their number one priority is every single day?
Coming home alive?
To come home. That's what they want to do. They want to go home to their house and their family. They don't want to, they will do pretty much anything to make sure that happens. And you can't ask somebody who has that as a priority to not use violence if they get into a situation that might stop them from doing that.
I think they have a lot more public support on their side, though. But Rose, they would have a lot more public support if they weren't out there enforcing these bullshit laws and doing it in a military fashion.
And then they wouldn't have to worry so much about coming home at the end of the day, because they'd have the support of the citizens. If they were pursuing actually violent criminals, they'd have people not testifying against them in court. Hey, yeah, I saw that officer violate this person's rights.
Well, it's the thing,
they would also have fewer laws to enforce in general.
Which one would you be more likely to go and assist? Car 3310, okay, or Officer Joe, who comes by your street every single day and stops in your store and buys stuff and talks to all the other shop owners, okay? It's a completely different experience. And New York City did this back when it was broke. Okay, that was their great idea, is that they're going to reduce the individual policing on the street and go to squad cars, and they've never gone back on it. And part of the reason that they have such horrible problems with the community is that they don't have officers in the community. And when they do, it's, they'll do community showcases, and at the school they'll come in and stuff like that, which is good. It's good. But again, people see the hulking, faceless sign of authority, going back to the qualified immunity, that has no check on their behavior, or very, very, as little as it could possibly be. Okay, what police officers have to do to get into serious issues is so beyond the pale. It's really unbelievable, and it it it's been created that way. It's not. This is not by accident. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. It's
Yeah.
not by accident. And
Well,
Right. As I was saying, I think, which you were once again touching on, yeah, I think when the police officers are actually part of their community, they have a vested interest in maintaining that community and maintaining good relations with the citizens, versus if they are someone from out of town, does not know the people, does not care what condition they leave the community in.
what about organized crime, though? Because when cops are local and organized crime knows where the police live, and they can hit them at their home, or they can pay them off, or they can, do other things the mob has historically done. What's the mechanism within a
see,
libertarian
the problem is that,
society?
like,
There's no consequences. You can't fire a cop if you find out he's taking bribes, because again, it's extremely hard to fire a corrupt cop, especially if the higher ups are also being paid.
I know, but I mean, within a libertarian society, what is stopping that whole formation of organized crime and, browbeating the police because they're not militant enough to be able to fight back?
So you're talking about the politicians now.
Well, the politicians get bought out by the mob too, right? Isn't that
Well,
why
but
we
that's,
need federal cops like the
ironically,
FBI?
That's like, it's literally like such a small issue at this point, because the ironic
Yeah,
part
the
is,
FBI has been successful.
yeah, but the ironic part about all of this is that organized crime doesn't want the trouble. You know what I'm saying? They'll run the neighborhoods at least more organized for the simple reason that they don't want to bother.
Well,
Like-
and they only can exist when there's prohibitions against the activities that create the black markets they thrive on.
Well, that's it.
Yep.
So
The only thing that they can actually charge for is protection in a libertarian free market society, right? And if we did have some higher level law and order, like state level, then if local police become a protection racket, well, what would the mechanism be to prevent that from happening?
Right. In
individual
theory,
weapons.
in theory, you'd have to have someone outgun them. So you'd have to have
an
state
armed
level-
citizenry, because
Yes.
again, this is where if the citizens weren't terrified to own weapons that they were going to go to jail, okay, you would have a protection racket trying to move into your neighborhood, and then, like the old days, a bunch of farmers with shotguns would get together and take care of the problem. Let's put it that way, okay?
A lot
We
of mobs
have-
started that way. I mean, you've seen The Godfather, right?
People used to run corrupt police officers out of town. Yes.
Right.
People used to not be so afraid to exert their rights, but over time that tendency was lost.
Well, the direction I thought we were going to go in, although I like this direction better, is that if there were insurance agencies working for, or working together, and they were on the hook when, people
Right.
got injured or property got destroyed, they would make sure that they enforced anti-corruption measures within the organizations they insured.
In general, yes. In a stateless society, most abuses or other concerns, such as, what if someone sells cyanide tablets labeled baby candy? Oh, well, normally, yeah, normally what would prevent this type of thing would be insurance. Like you want to buy our insurance policy, but we don't want to have to give some kind of huge payout. So we're going to need to see some proof that your product is safe. In the case of law enforcement, we're going to need to see some proof that you have a good record of doing the job that you were hired to do, not using excessive force, not violating people. And otherwise, we're not going to cover the cost of lawsuits, or we're just not going to sell you our insurance policy because that's too much of a risk for us.
Well, this is already happening in California, when they basically did the same thing. Is they say, well, you have to insure these people, and they're like, no, we don't,
Right.
or we have to raise the rates to ridiculous extremes because of that goes back to the fire issue. But
Almost like, no one would want to insure houses built in a super wildfire prone area if the state was not underwriting those
But they're
insurance
not
costs.
even. That's the ironic part in California is they're not underwriting them because the state knows the risk too. They're not stupid. So basically, they just insisted that the insurance companies do it, and the insurance, like, you know what? We'll just pack up our bags and leave.
Well, what about competition? Instead of packing up your bags and leaving, what if a community invited in another protection agency?
Well, but this is the thing: is that the state insisted that they insure those houses at a particular rate. So now you've basically locked the price, and the market's not
Yeah.
absorbing.
I get what you're saying. I'm talking about what we were describing a few minutes ago, where we're worried about a protection racket
Mhm.
and we're trying to prevent the local defense agency from basically creating a monopoly on violence,
So
within
basically,
that territory.
if they were to buy out the other security forces
And
and
become a
form
government.
a cartel, basically, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right,
I
but
mean,
see,
how would you
the
combat
market
that?
handles that too, because then what happens is everybody leaves. Okay.
Yeah, but not everybody's going to leave. I think a lot of people have to be pushed
It will
to
take
the
a lot of
absolute utmost extremity before they'll vote with their feet. I mean, there are people living in abject, awful conditions all around the world and throughout history. You would think they would leave. Let's also not forget that a lot of people can't leave. And so they
Understood.
will put up with monopolies on violence.
But under
Here we are, still in New York, right?
Yeah,
All three of us.
we stayed during
Yeah,
COVID.
what's
despite
wrong with
being
us?
one of the worst states to live in because the opportunity costs of packing up and leaving and trying to find work someplace else and leaving our family members behind were just too great. So we decided that we would try to wait it out.
Yeah, that's they waited out for what, This is
Yeah,
where,
no,
but like one of several things will happen in a basically open market society is one, some people may leave. Another is a bigger group will get together and say we're not going to tolerate this, or uh, the whole thing falls apart. That's the other thing is remember criminal enterprises tend to be violent internally as well as externally. So if you look at perfect example is like the mafia wars of the 70s in New York, they basically killed each other off, and if you can get an honest law enforcement agency, which I'm beginning to wonder if there is any in the United States anymore, uh, you could get them to basically clamp down on this stuff. And that's kind of where the federal government was supposed to be the check on all of this is that, hey, if these things are happening, we're the big guy. They're the big guy on the block, the big brother who's supposed to come and protect you. But instead, again, with the confiscation laws and all that, they're just another person trying to pick your pocket while they pretend to protect you. And
they're the ones that label you a domestic extremist.
domestic terrorist. Yeah.
And then, leave it to your local enforcement to kick down your door and arrest you in the middle of the night. And then they get to swoop in and take the credit for it and say, look how important we are. Oh, can we have a budget increase? Because we need to be able to catch more of these extremists. We have intelligence that there are more of them out there now.
But it's sad all the way around because, again, I don't see why people would want to be law enforcement. And this is the problem. It attracts the kind of person you don't want in law enforcement. The kind of person that just wants to be like a tin pot dictator of the neighborhood is not the person you want to be law enforcement. But because of the rules, because of the way it's set up, where the few good cops are accused of being the criminals, good law enforcement, and then the bad law enforcement is what basically is being rewarded. So where do you go from there? Like, how does that end in a good way? I don't know.
Well, it seems like we're not going to solve the problem perfectly unless we eliminate the state's monopoly on force, right? So that would allow private ownership of weapons and the legitimate use of them, right? And then also there would be competition in policing services because private armed people could choose to specialize in providing those services, or community groups could form and do community policing or a militia or something along those lines, right? And because private police forces would need to attract and retain customers, they'd be more courteous, they'd be more effective, and they would respect rights. And if they became brutal or corrupt, not only would customers leave if they could, but they would also be able to just revert back to protecting themselves or hiring a different company, right? But then also we would need to reduce the number of things that are considered crimes in the legal code. So a lot of things that are illegal right now would need to be cleared, right? And we would have to insist on basically just the non-aggression principle. We would have to have property rights, and that's it.
Well, but the thing is that it is kind of a self-correcting situation, because the reason this continues on in the big cities is because they keep getting outside funding. They keep
Hmm.
being able to do this. So no matter how many people depart, no matter how many people have basically their money stolen by the government, by the local governments, or they just keep getting more cash. But that is not a sustainable situation. It
Yeah,
can't
it
go
sounds
on
like
forever.
police forces need to be controlled and paid for by the
Right.
communities they serve.
And what happens when they run out of money, a la Detroit? Okay,
Hmm.
when Detroit ran out of money, all of a sudden the police force pulls back. Okay, they don't, because they're like, hey, we can't cover this anymore. We're going to protect our own or certain what we consider the key areas, and the rest of you, good luck, you're on your own.
Well,
And
that does beg the
Problem is, though,
question.
they don't they still like they don't cut back in ways that would benefit the people though. They continue things that generate revenue, like giving speeding tickets and issuing citations for various victimless crime laws. They just
Yeah,
don't bother to prosecute violent
you're
crimes. So
right.
that's the
Under our
problem.
existing system,
Whenever
yeah,
they lose
that's
funding,
yeah.
they stop prosecuting actual
well,
crime that brings victims.
but they also, what they'll do is they'll protect the politically connected rather than, and
Of course,
if you
they
look
pay
at
their
what happened in
salaries.
Detroit over the last 15, 20 years, okay, basically the police force abandoned any area that wasn't politically important to Detroit,
Mhm.
and people were left to basically try and do their own thing. And there's actually some interesting videos about a guy who started a police protection agency, like his own protection agency, where they were taught to de-escalate. They were taught to not initiate the force. And from the things that I've seen, it was very successful. You
Was
know,
Detroit where RoboCop took place?
Yep.
yes, yeah. But
Yeah,
this was
so
actually after that, because again, like they used Detroit because Detroit, even then back in the 70s, was declining.
mhm.
But then, was it Reagan or Bush when it really fell apart? Like it really went downhill, and they ended up, the federal government had to come in and basically bail them out, and it, because the city basically abandoned all of its responsibilities because they had no money, because it was probably, you know, being given out to every corrupt person, and not, I mean, they
Well,
weren't.
also the entire funding system that municipalities use and rely on is unsustainable. They issue bonds and,
Right.
they have these very rosy projections on how they're going to pay them back. And if those rosy projections aren't met exactly,
Hmm.
they're screwed. And then they end up in a debt cycle and they can't support the level of growth necessary to keep the tax base to pay for the infrastructure and the services that they need. So it's weird. You look at the cities that started with this bond method earliest, and they look like plots of mold, or
Hmm.
bacterial rings where they're dying in the center. And then they continue to expand outward, and those are the areas where growth is occurring
Yep.
because those suburbs were able to get the funding and to have the tax base. But then they too succumb, and eventually they die, and so on. And that's Detroit. If you look at
Yeah.
Detroit, it's this massive blight. But eventually, nature heals itself, and you're right. A lot of things are changing now because they just ran out of the ability to continue doing the things that weren't working.
Right.
So, does New York have to reach that state? Do we have to have a Detroit level near
If
collapse?
if
What I'm hoping is that all the corrupt people will just leave the state and then we can inherit it. That's probably not going to
I don't
happen.
see that
It seems like
happening.
you
No,
have
I
to
don't see
hit
that
rock. It
happening.
seems like you have to hit rock bottom before the citizens start to wake up and say, "Hey, this isn't right. We need to change this." You
But if
you see pockets of that. Like, for example, every time Like, for example, the Robert Brooks case that happened recently, like that reminded people, oh yeah, there's this serious problem with people, with officers being able to brutally beat people and facing no consequences, or if they do, like the taxpayers being on the hook for the consequences as opposed to the officers. Maybe we should do something about this. Like, sometimes you can kind of, sometimes there will be an event that gets people paying attention again.
Well, it'll reach the tipping point. That's the thing is, they have such firm control that it takes so much to reach that point where the citizenry says enough's enough. And the problem you have is that the people that remain in the city are the hardcore, they're the leftists. They want it. They live for the ideology, and it really, like, if you ask them how do you escape all this, how do you, oh, it's the big corporations problem, it's their fault, we should tax them all, and it's like the things that they say just don't make sense. They literally don't make any logical sense. And you look at the people that are representing New York now, like AOC. I mean, it's just like,
Yeah, but a lot of these people who, we think have laughable ideas they're the ones pushing to get rid of qualified immunity in New York.
they say
Uh,
that. See, that's the
well,
problem. Is
what about
saying
Bill A-1003?
Is that the recently introduced one?
Yeah.
Yeah, there has been renewed interest in eliminating this. New York City, actually, I think it was in 2021. New York City actually did eliminate qualified immunity, so there is law already in place. Like,
Yeah,
and it's been proven that it can be done. So,
Well, it's running into issues with the federal government, though, because officers can
yeah,
find ways to shift the jurisdiction. Like if they're on a federal state task force, they
it's the
can.
same with with like asset forfeiture.
yes.
Like,
Mhm.
even if local cops are stripped of their ability, they can just work with the feds and they still get a cut of it. So yeah, there's always some
Yeah.
kind of loophole without a nationwide reform.
You heard
Well, I
about
mean,
what happened in Arizona for that? Because the
they got
Arizona
rid of it, right?
state court, no, the state court said, I think it was Arizona, I forget which state, one of the states, Arizona, New Mexico, somewhere in there, said,
New
well,
Mexico,
sorry,
I think.
the legislature did not pass a law that allows you to shift this money to the federal government. So no, you can't do that. And that's probably the biggest, if you can get those kinds of decisions made. Okay, first of all, stop the asset forfeiture. It's a joke. It's not. Why? Okay, it's one thing if you want to confiscate, right? And it's bad enough. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's one level if you confiscate it, and then when they're convicted, you could say, yes, this is the proceeds of a crime, and we're going to auction it off. But to take someone's property who possibly hasn't even been accused of a crime, because this happens all the time, and then sell it off and then go, well, you can sue us to get it back, and then pass the money on to the feds because they'll give
Yeah.
you a cut back. It's like, it's literally a criminal
It's
enterprise.
a criminal enterprise.
It's literally a criminal. Like you're
and
doing that.
you have no redress except to go to the very courts run by the criminals themselves.
At the risk of bad Godfather imitations. So what are you gonna do for me? It's like that's literally, go to the Godfather, kiss the ring, and
Well,
you'll get a reward. It's like, what?
ultimately, that's what the state is. Your rights are privileges
Yeah, no.
for good behavior and for
They can
special
see
groups
again.
that the state decides it wants to, massage.
Hence the reason I'm a libertarian, and they can say that all they want. That doesn't make it the truth. See, and
Well, Bob,
we're here to remind people that it's not the truth. Okay, they can claim all
Yeah.
they want. They can claim that the moon is made of green cheese, but
ultimately, I
Well, I
think
think
that's the
that's why
best we
we're
can do.
here, and I think that's the purpose of our podcast, to drag this back to our platform and try to educate
Exactly.
people.
And to explain to people why do we say that the police should be held responsible for their actions just like anyone else? Okay, and again, if they're in the commission of their duties, yes, they should be cut some slack. because it's a very tough job, and no one disputes that. It's almost an impossible job. It's very
And there
difficult.
would be police under an anarchist utopia
Yes.
or a
There's still
free
going to be
market,
people who
There
enforce.
would-
and they would probably be paid better because it's a
True.
tough job, and appreciated more because they wouldn't be power trippy assholes going around enforcing
but-
stupid laws.
But what would
And
also
stealing
happen
stuff.
is, under a libertarian system or under a system that's free market, the power trippy a-holes would then be removed from the force because you can't afford them. Okay, in an open market system, when they become more expensive than the municipality can afford, you will have to get rid of them. The problem is now where you use the taxpayers' money to pay off suits and still keep these people in law enforcement. There's no way to sort the ones that are not good for the force to the ones that are good, loyal, people that want to just enforce the law.
Well, unless people vote the politicians out of office, it sounds like the only alternative is to basically opt out of the system, to find ways to create your own protection, to make the police obsolete. And
you like all of those walled enclaves that people are building left and right?
private communities.
And this is why. Because again, no, don't want the police here. We've got our own security. We don't need you. And that's...
while I'm very sensitive to the criticism that creates a layered society where poor people can't afford decent services, that's the society we already live in.
Yep.
And I feel like we can do better by outcompeting the existing system. Let it die like Detroit. While those of us who care survive.
In the meantime, you can have people forming communities. You can have them forming their own neighborhood watch groups that keep watch over things. Basically, community policing. Eventually, other communities might decide to start outsourcing that to private security firms. But people just need to kind of try to withdraw from the system, not attract as little attention as possible, and start finding alternatives to these government services that are not actually provided.
And to the extent that they can, they need to vote down all these stupid laws and increases in
local nullification. Yes.
Not to be a downer or anything, but I'll tell you when it changes is when things get bad enough and they go downhill far enough, then you end up with basically chaos and the state, and that's when, one way or another, it's going to change, whether it's for the better or for the worse.
Bob, I think that's a good note to end it on, because accelerationism is a whole other conversation.
We can have that conversation at some point, yeah.
Yeah. So right now, I think that if anybody is interested in learning more about the Libertarian platform and contacting us even, they can go to our website, lpny.org. You can read our platform, which articulates how we feel about rights and why qualified immunity is wrong, among other things, and puts forward a pretty coherent vision for what a libertarian society would be based on. And if you want to contribute to building that society, you can email us. The address will be up at the end of the video, and we would love to help you get involved at the state level or even at your local level. And with that, we'll say goodnight. It's been good liberty testing with you guys.
Good night.
Where will you be when the order is given to censor your mind as free speech is forbidden, as martyrs for peace from the world will be driven away by the sound of a bellowing thunder and choke on the blood of a dream going under? Tear up our Constitution, and from every direction we cry revolution, standing together and without permission, soldiers for truth in the war of attrition, the love of our country as I